In the history of NBA rivalries, few burned with the intensity of the New York Knicks and Indiana Pacers in the mid 1990s. It wasn't just basketball, it was theater, it was warfare, and it was personal. For three consecutive postseasons, these teams collided in a series of battles that defined an era of physical, punishing basketball. 8 points in 16.4 seconds, a headbutt that changed the series, a finger roll that missed by inches. This wasn't just playoff basketball, this was blood, sweat, and sneakers. This is the story of how a small market team from Indiana challenged New York's basketball throne and how their confrontations created one of the most captivating rivalries the NBA has ever seen. Think Lakers Celtics, but with more punches thrown and fewer championships to show for it. Picture this. It is 1993. The NBA is still Jordan's league, and the New York Knicks have finally figured out how to be good at basketball again. Pat Riley, fresh off his Hollywood Lakers run, had transformed this franchise from the laughing stock that gave us the Patrick Ewing lottery conspiracy into a legitimate Eastern Conference powerhouse. They just won 60 games, earned the top speed, and Patrick Ewing was putting together the kind of season that made you forget he wasn't Hakeem Olajuwon. Their first-round opponent? The Indiana Pacers. And I'm not talking about the Pacers who would later terrorize the Palace of Auburn Hills or the ones who almost beat LeBron. I'm talking about the Pacers who were still trying to convince people they belonged in the same conversation as actual NBA teams. Sure, they had Reggie Miller, this skinny shooting guard from UCLA who could drain threes from the parking lot. But this was before Miller became Reggie Miller. Capital letters, Nick Killer extraordinaire. Back then, he was just Cheryl's little brother who happened to be pretty good at basketball. The kind of player you'd describe as solid and a good shooter, without realizing you were looking at a future Hall of Famer. Nobody saw what was coming. The series opener at Madison Square Garden looked like exactly what everyone expected. A 107-104 Knicks victory that felt closer than it should have been. The Pacers had been down by 19 points in the third quarter. This should have been game over against a Pat Riley team, but Indiana kept clawing back, making it a one-possession game in the final minutes. Doc Rivers, yes, that Doc Rivers, back when he was still playing point guard instead of trying to manage egos in Los Angeles and Boston, delivered the most prophetic quote of the series. Doc was basically saying what every Knicks fans was thinking. We just let these guys hang around way too long, and it was the first sign that maybe Indiana wasn't going to roll over and play dead like everyone expected. Patrick Ewing saved the day with a clutch 17-foot jumper with 10.8 seconds left, then made the defensive play of the game on Reggie Miller. But even then, you could sense something brewing between Miller and the Knicks during timeouts. Miller would sidle up John Starks and whisper things like, "You can't guard me," and they should have sent someone else. And Starks, who had this perpetual chip on his shoulder from going undrafted and bagging groceries before making the NBA, was the perfect target for Miller's psychological warfare. It was like watching someone poke a sleeping bear with a stick, not realizing the bear was about to wake up very, very angry. The real fireworks came in Game 3. By this point, the trash talk between Starks and Miller had escalated from friendly playoff banter to genuine animosity. These guys legitimately did not like each other. With 8:48 left in the third quarter, after an entire game's worth of verbal warfare, Starks finally reached his breaking point. Right there in front of 16,000 people and a national television audience, John Starks launched his head directly into Reggie Miller's face. Not a little bump, not an accidental collision, a full-on headbutt that would have been a hockey player proud. Miller, showing the kind of acting skills that would make him perfect for TNT broadcasts years later, immediately crumpled to the floor like he'd been shot by a sniper. Right, and I'm sure Miller spent the whole game complimenting Starks on his shooting form and asking about his family. Had been in Starks' ear all series, reminding him about every missed shot, every turnover, every time he'd gotten beaten off the dribble. By Game 3, Starks had simply had enough of Miller's voice. Starks got immediately ejected, and the Pacers turned a close game into a blowout. It was one of those moments when you could literally feel the momentum of an entire series shift. Patrick Ewing and Charles Oakley had to physically restrain Starks afterward, while Riley pointed him toward the tunnel like a parent sending a misbehaving child to his room. Riley was absolutely furious in his post-game press conference. That is Riley's speak for "my point guard just lost his damn mind on national television, and I'm questioning all my life choices right now." Riley had built his entire coaching philosophy around discipline and execution, and here was Starks completely melting down in a crucial playoff game. But that momentary insanity from Starks became the spark that ignited one of the basketball's greatest rivalries. The Knicks managed to regroup and close out the series in Game 4, with Doc Rivers putting together one of those veteran point guard performances that remind you why experience matters in the playoffs. Rivers scored 21 points, including 16 in the final 8 minutes, to help New York escape with a 109-100 overtime victory. Charles Smith, always the voice of brutal honesty, captured the Knicks' feelings perfectly. Smith nailed the Knicks' fundamental problem right there. They had this bizarre tendency to abandon what was working the moment they got comfortable. It is like they had a self-destruct button they couldn't help but push whenever they got ahead by double digits. For Indiana, it was end of their season, but the beginning of something much bigger. For New York, it was merely the first step in what they hoped would be a championship run. What neither team realized was, this brief first-round encounter was merely the opening chapter in what would become an epic 3-year saga that would define both franchises. Fast forward 1 year, and everything had changed. Michael Jordan was chasing fly balls in Birmingham instead of championships in Chicago, which meant the Eastern Conference was suddenly wide open for the first time since the late 1980s. There was the throne, and every contender was measuring themselves for the crown. The Knicks had spent the entire season preparing for this moment. Their best chance yet to reach the NBA Finals without having to go through his airness. Meanwhile, the Pacers had undergone their own transformation under new coach Larry Brown, the basketball nomad who had the habit of showing up in random cities and immediately making everyone better at basketball. Brown was perfect coach for Indiana, a defense-first, no-nonsense guy who could take a collection of role players and mold them into a legitimate contender. Donnie Walsh, the Pacers president, understood exactly what they were trying to accomplish. Walsh was basically saying, "You're copying your homework, New York, and we're not even trying to hide it." The Pacers were following the exact blueprint Riley had used to transform the Knicks. Pair a talented center with a dynamic guard, surround them with tough role players, let a disciplined coach make it all work. By this point, the Spike Lee-Reggie Miller dynamic had evolved into its own fascinating subplot. Spike would show up in his orange Knicks gear, sitting courtside like he was directing his own personal basketball movie, while Miller used every one of Spike's gestures and comments as fuel for his performance. It was the NBA's strangest celebrity-athlete relationship playing out in real time on national television. Game 1 set the tone for another physical grinding series. The Knicks jumped out on an early lead behind Patrick Ewing's dominance, but the Pacers refused to go away quietly. Rick Smits, the 7'4" center from the Netherlands, who looked like he should be playing in a EuroLeague game somewhere, suddenly started playing like a legitimate all-star, scoring 27 points and going to toe-to-toe with Ewing. We are talking about Rick Smits here, the dunking Dutchman, a guy who looked like he'd rather be at home reading a book than playing in the NBA Finals. But there he was, hitting turnaround jumpers and hook shots like he was channeling Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The Knicks still managed to win 189. thanks largely to a clutch three-pointer from Hubert Davis. But Indiana had sent a message. They were not intimidated by the Garden or the moment. Game 2 belonged to the Knicks defense, which completely suffocated Reggie Miller in a dominant 89-78 victory. Miller managed just 10 points on 3 for 10 shooting, looking lost against New York's switching defense and John Starks' relentless pressure. Even Larry Brown had to admit that Miller's mouth had gotten him in trouble. That's coach speak for my shooting guard needs to shut up and focus on basketball instead of trying to out-trash talk the entire city of New York. Brown was old school to his core. He wanted his players to let their play do the talking, but Reggie couldn't help himself. Trash talking wasn't just a part of his game, it was his superpower. The series shifted to Indianapolis for Game 3 and 4, and everything changed. In Game 3, Patrick Ewing, the anchor of the Knicks defense, their best player, their franchise cornerstone, scored exactly 1 point. 1 single point. Let me repeat that for emphasis. Patrick Ewing, in a playoff game, scored 1 point. It was the lowest scoring output of his entire NBA career, and it happened in the Eastern Conference Finals. Ewing was plagued by the foul trouble all game long, picking up cheap calls that had him sitting down on the bench while Rick Smits went to work. The Pacers destroyed New York 88-68. Ewing was genuinely frustrated afterward, which was rare for someone who usually kept his emotions in check. When Patrick Ewing starts complaining about officiating, you know things have gotten bad. This was a guy who typically took whatever the refs gave him and move on, but he couldn't stay on the floor long enough to impact the game, and when he was playing, he couldn't find any rhythm. Game 4 brought more heartbreak for New York. The Knicks entering the fourth quarter, but somehow managed to blow it, losing 83-77 as the series deadlocked at 2-2. It was becoming a disturbing pattern. The Knicks would build a lead, then find creative ways to give it back when the pressure mounted. But Game 5 would go down as one of the greatest individual performances in NBA playoff history. May 18, 1994, Madison Square Garden. The series tied 2-2. The Knicks leading by 12 points entering the fourth quarter. Everything set up perfectly for New York to take control. Enter Reggie Miller. What happened over the next 12 minutes transcended basketball and crossed into realm of pure theater. Miller erupted for 25 points in the fourth quarter, outscoring the entire Knicks team while single-handedly stealing a game that seemed completely out of reach. When Miller described being in that kind of zone, his explanation was perfect. That is as accurate a description of athletic transcendence as you'll ever hear. When you're that locked in, it is like you're playing a completely different game than everyone else. Time slows down, the basket looks enormous, every defensive rotation becomes predictable. After drilling yet another three-pointer, Miller turned toward Spike Lee, who had been jawing at him all game from his courtside seat, and made the infamous choke gesture, wrapping his hand around his throat. The NBA's ultimate villain was born in that moment, and you could feel 8 million New Yorkers simultaneously throwing things at their televisions. Lester Connor, the Pacers' backup point guard, revealed the full story afterward. See, this is what people didn't understand at that time. Spike Lee wasn't getting in Miller's head, he was focusing him. All that courtside trash talk wasn't a distraction, it was motivation. Reggie needed someone to prove wrong, someone to silence, and Spike, in his orange Knicks gear, pointing and screaming and waving his arms, became the perfect target. The Pacers stunned the Garden crowd 93-86, taking a 3-2 series lead back to Indianapolis. Miller's post-game comments revealed just how personal this had become. This wasn't just basketball talk anymore. Miller was essentially admitting that his earlier respectful competitor persona had been an act. The real Reggie was this trash-talking, spike-towning force of nature who lived to silence opposing crowd and break the hearts of the superstars. The Knicks were one loss away from elimination, facing the very real possibility that their best championship opportunity in 2 decades was about to slip away. The pressure on Patrick Ewing was immense. This might be his last, best chance to win the title that eluded him throughout his career. But in Game 6 at Market Square Arena, the Knicks showed exactly why they'd been one of the league's best teams all season. Ewing delivered a dominant 25-point, 15-rebound performance, while the Knicks defense held Miller without a field goal for 3 quarters in a convincing 92-82 victory. Even Miller had to give credit where it was due. Coming from Miller, that was the ultimate compliment. Their personal battle had become the series within the series. With every possession turning into a psychological warfare, Starks was fighting to stay disciplined and not let Miller bait him into another meltdown, while Miller was trying to find any weakness he could exploit. As the teams headed back to New York for Game 7, Ewing made a simple promise to the waiting media: "See you Sunday." Just 3 words, but it carried the weight of an entire franchise championship hopes. It was like Babe Ruth calling a shot. If Babe Ruth has been carrying the expectations of 8 million people on his shoulders. Game 7, MSG, winner advanced to the NBA Finals. Loser goes home to contemplate what might have been. The game was everything you'd expect from these two teams. A brutal defensive struggle where every possession felt like it lasted an hour. With 26.9 seconds remaining, the Knicks trailed by 2 when John Starks missed a driving layup. In that moment, it looked like another season was about to end in heartbreak for New York. But Patrick Ewing, soaring through the air like he was 22 years old again, grabbed the rebound and slammed it home to give Knicks the lead. It was the kind of play that defines careers, the franchise player making the play when everything is on the line. Pat Riley's reaction said it all. Simple words, but loaded with meaning. After years of criticism about not being clutch enough, about not being able to win the big one, here was Ewing's coach acknowledging that when it matters the most, the big man delivered. The Pacers had one final chance, but Reggie Miller's desperation three-pointer missed. The Knicks had survived, advancing to the NBA Finals with a 94-90 victory that left the entire Garden shaking. For Indiana, it was a devastating end to a breakthrough season. For New York, it was vindication, but not yet satisfaction. They still needed 4 more wins against Hakeem Olajuwon and the Houston Rockets to capture that elusive championship. The Knicks would ultimately lose the finals in 7 games, but their epic struggle with the Pacers had established something special, one of the NBA's premier rivalries built on mutual respect and genuine dislike. 12 months later, fate brought these teams together again for what would become the rubber match of their trilogy. Both teams had changed, but the animosity remained as strong as ever. This wasn't just a playoff series anymore. This was a blood feud with basketball uniforms. Patrick Ewing was now 32 years old, still chasing that first championship ring, while his body slowly betrayed him. Nagging calf injuries limited his mobility, and you could see the mileage adding up with each game. All those battles in the paint, all those playoff wars were starting to take their toll. Rick Smith's being diplomatically honest captured what everyone could see. Translation: Patrick wasn't the same player anymore. The legs that had carried him through the decade of dominance were finally showing their age. Meanwhile, Reggie Miller had been completely transformed by the previous year's playoff battles. He was no longer just a talented shooter who could get hot. He had become Reggie Miller, complete with capital letters and italics. The Knick Killer, the Garden Silencer, the villain New York loved to hate more than anyone not named Bill Buckner. His relationship with Spike Lee had evolved into this bizarre basketball theater of the absurd. Before games, they'd sometimes chat cordially, like old friends catching up. Then the moment the ball was tipped, they'd transform into mortal enemies, with Lee standing and gesturing while Miller would deliberately seeking him out after big shots. It was like watching the strangest body cop movie ever made, where the cops actually wanted to arrest each other. Game 1 appeared to be following the same script as always, the Knicks building a comfortable lead at home, looking ready to steal home court advantage. With 18.7 seconds left, New York was up by 6 points. The newspapers were practically writing their "Knicks take control" headlines. What happened next still doesn't seem real, even decades later. First, Miller drained a quick three-pointer, cutting the lead to 3 with 16.4 seconds remaining. No big deal, teams hit desperation threes all the time. But then, incredibly, Anthony Mason struggled with the inbound pass, and Miller swooped in like a basketball pickpocket, stealing the ball and immediately stepping back behind the three-point line. He was basically saying, "Thanks for the early Christmas present, Anthony," but the audacity of what happened next was off the charts. Instead of driving to the basket for a high percentage shot, Miller immediately stepped back for another three-pointer. That is confidence bordering on insanity. The kind of decision that either makes you a legend or gets you benched forever. The shot went in, tying the game at 105. After John Starks missed 2 crucial free throws, Miller grabbed the rebound, got fouled by Anthony Mason, and calmly sank both free throws to complete one of the most impossible comebacks in playoffs history. 8 points in 16.4 seconds. The Garden went from deafening to dead silent in less than 20 seconds of the game time. As Miller headed toward the tunnel, he reportedly screamed, "Choke artists!" at the Knicks bench. And when he ran past Spike Lee, he looked right at him and repeated the same choke gesture from the previous year. The student had become the master, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget it. John Starks, showing the kind of brutal honesty that made him beloved in New York, took full responsibility. That is what made Starks special. He'd rather take the blame himself than let his teammates share in his failure. But it also showed up how personally he took these battles with Miller. This wasn't just team versus team for him. It was personal war that played out on basketball's biggest stage. The Knicks responded in Game 2, holding Miller to just 10 points in a dominant 96-77 victory, but the psychological damage was done. The Pacers had stolen home court advantage with one of the most spectacular thefts in NBA history. Larry Brown, always wary of Miller antics, tried to keep his star player focused. That is Brown's diplomatic way of telling Reggie to shut up and play basketball, but Miller couldn't help himself. The trash talk was as much a part of his identity as his jump shot. When the series shifted to Indianapolis, the Pacers seized the complete control, taking both games to put the Knicks in a 3-1 hole. Smiths continued to give Ewing problems, while New York's offense sputtered at all the wrong moments. The Knicks were one loss away from elimination, facing odds that seemed almost impossible to overcome. Only 4 teams at that time in NBA history had ever come back from 3-1 deficit in the playoffs. This wasn't just an uphill battle, it was climbing Mount Everest in flip-flops during a blizzard. Pat Riley, facing the biggest challenge of his coaching career, delivered one of the most memorable speeches. This was peak Riley, the master motivator trying to will his team back from the brink through sheer force of personality. Say what you want about his coaching style, but when his team needed the inspiration most, Riley knew exactly which buttons to push. Back at Madison Square Garden for Game 5, the Knicks faced elimination with the kind of desperation that either breaks teams apart or forges them into something special. With 5.9 seconds left and Indiana leading by 1 after a Byron Scott three-pointer, it looked like the season was over. But in a moment that perfectly mirrored the Game 7 victory from the previous year, Patrick Ewing took the inbounds pass, spun into the lane and hit a soft one-hander with 1.8 seconds remaining to save the Knicks season. For that moment, maybe he was. And you had to love Patrick. Usually so serious, so burdened by expectations, could crack a joke after hitting the biggest shot of the season. The pressure might have been crushing him, but he wasn't going to show it. Spike Lee and Reggie Miller's ongoing feud reached new heights during Game 5. Lee had been chanting "Cheryl, Cheryl" at Miller, mocking him about his more famous sister. Miller's response afterward was telling, "Sometimes Spike opens his mouth a little too much and gets the guy going." It was the NBA's strangest celebrity relationship, playing out on national television with millions of people watching two grown men try to psychologically destroy each other through basketball. Game 6 in Indianapolis became another test of the Knicks' survival instincts. The tension was so high that Anthony Mason and Charles Smith got into a heated argument on the bench during the second quarter. This wasn't a team in perfect harmony. This was a group of veterans who knew their championship window was closing fast. Riley understood exactly what his team needed. Sometimes that edge is exactly what you need when your back is against the wall. Riley knew his team's intensity was both their greatest strength and their biggest weakness. They needed that fire to survive, even if it occasionally burned each other in the process. That emotional intensity fueled the Knicks to a 92-82 victory, forcing a decisive Game 7 back at Madison Square Garden. Against all odds, these two teams were going to meet for another winner-take-all showdown. May 21, 1995. Almost exactly 1 year after the previous Game 7 battle, the Knicks and Pacers prepared for another fight to the death. The basketball gods apparently decided one Game 7 between these teams wasn't enough drama for everyone involved. Miller came out firing, scoring 29 points through 3 quarters to give the Pacers lead heading into the final period. Each time he'd make a big shot, he'd look over Spike Lee, who was uncharacteristically quiet. Even Spike seems to realize that pounding Miller at this point was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Ewing, fighting through his leg injuries and the weight of an entire city's expectations, countered with 29 points and 14 rebounds to keep Knicks within striking distance. This was like watching two heavyweight boxers in the 15th round, both exhausted but too proud to go down. With 1:18 left, Rick Smith hit a 14-footer to give Pacers a 97-92 lead. For a moment, it looked like Indiana was finally going to break through, but the Knicks rallied, pulling within 2 on John Starks' three-pointer with 32.3 seconds remaining. After getting a defensive stop, the Knicks had one final chance with 5 seconds left. Derek Harper's inbound pass found Ewing near top of the key, almost exact same spot from which he had won Game 5. Ewing spun past Derek McKee and drove hard to the basket. The lane was open. The shot, a finger roll rather than a dunk, looked perfect leaving his hand. Sometimes the difference between immortality and heartbreak is measured in millimeters. Patrick chose finesse when power might have been the better option. But it was a split-second decision that athletes replay in their minds for the rest of their lives. The ball hit the back rim and bounced out as time expired. The Pacers erupted in celebration. After 2 consecutive years of playoff elimination at the hands of the Knicks, Indiana had finally broken through. For Reggie Miller, it was the sweetest revenge possible. For Patrick Ewing, it was another cruel chapter in his quest for a championship that would never come. Pat Riley would never coach another game for the Knicks, leaving for Miami that summer to start over with a new team and new challenges. Anthony Mason, Charles Oakley, and John Starks would all eventually move on as well. The roster that had come so close to greatness was dismantled piece by piece. Over 3 consecutive postseasons, the Knicks and Pacers gave basketball fans a rivalry that defined what playoff basketball should be. Intense, personal, and absolutely unforgettable. This was the NBA's version of Ali Frazier, with each battle somehow more epic than the last. For Patrick Ewing, these series represented both the pinnacle and the nadir of his Hall of Fame career. He showed off his greatness in Game 7 moments, but also his limitations when his body finally betrayed him. The finger roll that bounced out will haunt Knicks fans forever, but it shouldn't overshadow everything Ewing accomplished in those 3 years. For Reggie Miller, the rivalry transformed him to a merely a talented shooter into a basketball icon. The type of villain that every great sports story needs. Without the Knicks as his foil, Miller might have been just another good player who could get hot. Against them, he became legendary. The John Starks-Reggie Miller subplot became one of the most compelling individual rivalries in NBA history. Their trash-talking battles represented everything great about playoff basketball: the personal stakes, the psychological warfare, the way individual matchups can define the entire series. And Spike Lee's involvement added a cultural dimension that made this rivalry transcend sports entirely. The Miller-Lee dynamic, from courtside taunts to choke gestures to grudging respect, turned basketball games into a performance art. Charles Smith, always the voice of reason, captured how the Knicks felt about Miller perfectly. These 3 years, Miller proved he was much more than a front-runner. He was a legitimate star who could back up his talk when it matters the most, even if it meant breaking the hearts of an entire city in the process. These series represented more than just basketball. They were clash of cultures, big market glamour versus small market determination, the heartland taking on the capital of the basketball world. They were stories of redemption, heartbreak, heroism, and revenge, all wrapped up in 48-minute packages that left everyone emotionally exhausted. The 1993-95 chapters of the Knicks-Pacers rivalry represent NBA playoff basketball at its absolute finest, where the margins between victory and defeat, between glory and despair, can be measured in fractions of inches and tenths of seconds. But this wasn't the end of the story. After a 3-year intermission, these teams would reunite for another trilogy of playoff battles that would prove every bit as dramatic as the first. The 4-point play, the Larry Johnson shot, the 8-seeded Knicks' miraculous run. The Pacers-Knicks rivalry was far from over. It was just taking a breather before the next act began.